Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness carry the greatest power to change a life forever. In a world where most people walk past those in need, one person's daily gesture of compassion can awaken something extraordinary. Every evening in a small Viking village, a giant blacksmith named Rurik brought a bowl of warm food to a quiet widow named Liv, who sat alone on a wooden bench. For 3 years, this simple ritual continued. No words needed, just human decency in its purest form. But Liv wasn't just any widow. She was actually Queen Thyra of Vestfjord, stripped of her crown and forced into hiding after her own cousin betrayed her in a bloody coup. She had chosen to live as a peasant rather than fight for her throne. Yet Rurik's daily kindness slowly began to awaken the royal strength that still burned within her heart. When enemy ships threaten their village, will the hidden queen finally reveal herself to save the man who saved her? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wooden bowl had seen 3 winters, and its grain had darkened from the oils of countless meals. Rurik's massive hands cradled it, with the same reverence a priest might hold a sacred chalice, though he would have laughed at such a comparison. The bowl was simple pine, carved during the long nights when sleep eluded him and his thoughts grew too heavy for rest. Each evening, as the forge fires dimmed to glowing embers, he would fill it with whatever stew or porridge he had prepared, always enough for 2. Though he ate alone, the village of Bjornstad hugged the coastline like a child clinging to its mother's skirt. Its wooden houses weathered grey by salt winds and time. Smoke rose from chimneys in lazy spirals, carrying the scents of cooking fish and burning pine. The harbour held a dozen fishing boats, their hulls scarred by years of wrestling with the North Sea's temperamental moods. Beyond the village, dark forests stretched toward mountains that scraped the belly of ever-present clouds. Rurik's forge sat at the village's heart, its chimney the tallest structure save for the longhouse where the Jarl held court. The building itself seemed to pulse with life, red light dancing through the doorway, the rhythmic ring of hammer on anvil echoing across the square like a great heartbeat. Inside, the air shimmered with heat waves, and sparks cascaded like falling stars each time Rurik brought his hammer down upon glowing iron. He was a mountain of a man, standing nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to yoke an ox. His beard, the color of autumn oak leaves, hung to his chest in intricate braids, threaded with iron rings he had forged himself. Scars decorated his arms like ancient runes, some from the forge, others from battles he preferred not to remember. His eyes, pale blue as winter sky, held depths that spoke of sorrows carefully buried beneath layers of quiet dignity. The other villagers treated him with respectful distance. They brought their broken tools and blunted weapons, paid his fair prices, and exchanged pleasantries about weather and fishing. But few lingered to share ale or stories. Perhaps it was his size that intimidated them, or perhaps they sensed the carefully contained power that radiated from him like heat from his forge. Rurik had learned long ago that some men were meant to stand apart, and he had made peace with solitude the way a ship makes peace with storms, by weathering them with patient endurance. His routine never varied. Dawn brought him to the forge, where he would coax the previous day's embers back to life and begin the ancient dance of fire and iron. Midday meant a simple meal of bread and cheese, eaten standing while he planned the afternoon's work. Evening brought the day's final projects: horseshoes for Gunnar's mare, arrowheads for young Eric's first hunting bow, or the endless repair of farm tools worn by honest labor. But as the sun touched the western hills and painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, Rurik would set aside his smith's apron and move to the small alcove behind his forge, where he kept his personal quarters. There, in a corner that caught the last light of day, sat a simple wooden table bearing 2 bowls, 2 spoons, and a pot that always held something warm and nourishing. He would fill one bowl, cover it with a cloth to keep in the heat, and walk the 50 paces to the village square where she waited. Viking. She had appeared 3 winters ago, on a night when snow fell like tears, and the wind carried the bite of coming famine. No one knew from where she had come. The guards at the village gate swore no travelers had passed. Yet there she sat on the wooden bench beside the well, wrapped in a cloak so worn its original color had become a mystery. Her hands were pale and slender, unmarked by the calluses that branded most villagers as farmers or fishermen. Her face, though lined with the grief of middle years, retained the kind of beauty that made men pause in their daily tasks and wonder about the stories hidden behind her quiet grey eyes. The bench where she sat each evening commanded a view of the entire village square. From there, she could see the children playing their games of warriors and raiders, the women gathering at the well to share gossip with their water, and the men returning from their boats with the day's catch. She watched it all with the attention of someone learning a new language, her eyes cataloguing details that others took for granted. She spoke little, and only when spoken to directly. Her voice carried an accent that seemed familiar yet foreign, like a childhood song half remembered. When she did speak, her words were carefully chosen, polite but distant, as if she feared saying too much might somehow betray a secret too dangerous to share. The village women had tried to befriend her at first. Astrid, the baker's wife, brought her warm bread. Sigrid, the weaver, offered her wool for warmer clothing. Old Helga, who knew every family's history going back 5 generations, attempted to draw out Liv's story with the persistence of a hunter tracking wounded prey. But Liv accepted their kindnesses with gracious thanks and revealed nothing more of herself than a polite smile and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of kingdoms. The men were more direct in their curiosity. Olaf the fisherman wondered aloud why a woman of her obvious breeding lived alone and seemingly without means. Bjorn the merchant suggested she might be running from a violent husband or a family debt. Even Jarl Magnus had questioned her presence, though gently, during one of his evening walks through the village. To all inquiries, Liv gave the same response. She was a widow seeking a quiet place to live out her remaining years. Nothing more. Rurik had been the only one who never asked. That first night, seeing her sitting in the cold with nothing but her thin cloak for warmth, he had simply walked over and placed the covered bowl in her hands. She had looked up at him with those storm-grey eyes, and for a moment he had seen something flicker there, surprise, perhaps, or a gratitude so deep it bordered on pain. She had nodded once, a gesture both humble and somehow regal, and whispered words of thanks in a voice like silk over steel. The next evening, she had been there again. And again, he had brought the bowl, this time with a wooden spoon wrapped in clean cloth. By the third night, their routine had established itself without a single word of negotiation or expectation. He would come at sunset. She would be waiting. He would place the bowl in her hands, and she would accept it with that same graceful nod. Sometimes their fingers would brush during the exchange, and he would feel the surprising softness of hands that had once known gentler work than survival. The village had watched this ritual with growing fascination. Some called Rurik foolish for feeding a stranger when his own larder was modest. Others whispered that the mysterious woman must be using some form of magic to enchant the normally practical blacksmith. A few suggested more carnal motivations, though these voices were quickly hushed when they remembered the respectful distance Rurik maintained and the way Liv carried herself with the dignity of a woman accustomed to honor as months turned to seasons and seasons to years. The daily feeding became as natural as sunrise. The villagers grew accustomed to seeing Rurik emerge from his forge each evening, bowl in hand, walking with measured steps toward the woman who waited with patient stillness. Children playing in the square would pause their games to watch, sensing something important in the ritual, even if they couldn't name what it was. Liv, for her part, had woven herself into the village's rhythm with the skill of someone long practiced in adaptation. She helped Astrid during busy baking days, her hands revealing an unexpected knowledge of fine pastries that spoke of kitchens far grander than any in Bjornstadt. She mended clothes for the widowed mothers, her needlework so precise and beautiful that several women begged to know where she had learned such techniques. She tended sick children with remedies that worked better than old Helga's traditional cures, demonstrating knowledge of herbs that grew far from the northern coast. Yet for all her integration into village life, Liv remained an enigma wrapped in courtesy and quiet strength. She lived in a small room above the grain store, paying her modest rent by helping the merchant's wife with her accounts. Her ability with numbers impressed even the calculating Bjorn, though she claimed to have learned such skills from a husband who had traded in distant markets before his death in a ship. Wreck that she described with just enough detail to discourage further questions. The truth was far more complex and dangerous than anyone in Bjornstad could have imagined. The woman they knew as Liv had once commanded the loyalty of thousands, had worn a crown of gold and amber, had made decisions that shaped the fates of kingdoms. But that life seemed like a dream now, or perhaps a nightmare from which she had finally awakened. Here in this simple village, watching Rurik emerge each evening with his offering of food and unquestioning kindness, she had found something she had never known even in the heights of power: peace. The wooden bowl had become a bridge between two souls who had both learned that the heart's greatest treasures often came disguised as simple gifts. Neither spoke of the growing warmth that passed between them, the way their eyes would linger just a moment longer during each exchange, or how Rurik had begun adding special touches to his cooking on days when Liv seemed particularly weary. Neither acknowledged how Liv had started timing her evening walks to catch glimpses of Rurik at his forge, or how she had quietly gathered information about his past. From the village, women who remembered his arrival 15 years ago with wounds that had taken months to heal. They were two people who had learned that some wounds could only be healed by time and kindness, and that the most profound connections often grew in the soil of unspoken understanding. The bowl that passed between them each evening carried more than food. It carried the promise that neither would face the gathering darkness alone. The messenger arrived on a morning when the sea lay flat as hammered silver, and the air carried the promise of an early winter. His horse's hooves struck the frozen ground like drumbeats, announcing news that would shatter the peaceful rhythm of village life. The young man wore the colors of Jarl Magnus's sworn ally, Jarl Eriksson of the eastern settlements, but his face bore the pallor of someone who had ridden hard through sleepless nights. Rurik was shaping a new plough blade when the commotion reached his ears. Voices carried across the square, urgent, fearful tones that made him set down his hammer and step outside. A crowd had gathered around the messenger, who swayed slightly in his saddle as exhaustion battled with the importance of his message. "Raiders from the Bloodaxe clan," the messenger gasped, accepting a cup of water from Astrid with shaking hands. "They've taken 3 villages already, burned everything, killed the men, took the women and children for slaves. They're moving west along the coast." Jarl Magnus pushed through the crowd, his face grim beneath his graying beard. "How many ships?" 15 longships, maybe 20, led by Ragnar Bloodaxe himself." The messenger's voice cracked. "My lord, they're not just raiding, they're claiming territory. Ragnar calls himself a king now, says he's come to unite all the coastal clans under his rule or see them burn." A collective intake of breath swept through the gathered villagers. Ragnar Bloodaxe was a name spoken in whispers, a warrior whose cruelty had become legend, even among a people who valued strength above all else. Stories told of villages left as smoking ruins, of warriors who surrendered being fed to his ravens alive, of children taken not just as slaves but as offerings to his dark gods. "When will they reach us?" Magnus asked. 3 days, perhaps 4 if the weather turns against them." Rurik felt something cold settle in his stomach, not fear, exactly, but the familiar weight of approaching violence that he had hoped never to feel again. Around him the villagers erupted in frightened chatter. Some spoke of fleeing inland, others of sending their families away while the men prepared to fight. A few suggested surrender, though their voices carried little conviction. From the edge of the crowd, he caught sight of Liv. She stood apart from the others, her face carefully composed, but her knuckles were white where she gripped her cloak. For a moment her eyes met his across the square, and he saw something in them that made his breath catch, not fear but a kind of terrible recognition, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "We cannot fight 20 ships with fishing boats and farm tools," old Gunnar declared, his weathered hands trembling. "We should take what we can carry and flee to the mountains and live like wolves in the forests." Bjorn the merchant protested. "This is our home. Our fathers built these houses. Our families are buried in this ground." Jarl Magnus raised his hand for silence. "I'll not abandon Bjornstad without a fight. But Gunnar speaks truth. We cannot match Ragnar's numbers. Our only hope is to send word to our allies, pray they can reach us in time, and prepare our defenses." "What defenses?" Eric the young hunter asked bitterly. "We have no walls, no shields, no trained warriors, save a handful of us who've seen battle." The crowd turned to look at Rurik, and he felt the weight of their expectations like a physical thing. They knew fragments of his story, that he had been a warrior once, before he came to Bjornstad, seeking nothing but peace and the chance to build rather than destroy. They had seen the scars that decorated his arms, had watched him move with the fluid grace of someone trained for violence, even as he chose the peaceful path of craft and creation. "I'll fight," he said simply, his deep voice carrying easily across the square. "Any man who wants to learn to hold a blade, I'll teach him. Any woman who wants to know how to use a knife or bow, I'll show her. We may not have walls, but we have courage. And sometimes that's enough." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. But Rurik's attention was drawn back to Liv. She had moved closer, close enough that he could see the conflict playing across her features, like shadows and light. Her lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but then she pressed them together and looked away. Jarl Magnus nodded grimly. "Then we prepare for war. Every able-bodied man will train with Rurik. The women and children will gather supplies and prepare to retreat to the Longhouse if our defenses fail. We send riders to our allies. Your allies won't come." The voice cut through the Jarl's words like a blade through silk. Every head turned toward Liv, who stood now with her back straight and her chin raised. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The humble widow was gone, replaced by someone who spoke with the authority of long command. "What did you say?" Magnus asked, his tone careful. Liv's grey eyes swept across the crowd, and for a moment Rurik saw her as if for the first time. The way she held herself, the careful modulation of her voice, the commanding presence that seemed to fill the space around her, these were not the traits of a simple widow seeking quiet. "Retirement. Ragnar Bloodaxe moves too quickly for your messages to reach. Allied Jarls and for them to gather forces and return," she said. "By the time help could arrive, you would all be dead or in chains. He plans it this way: strike fast, claim territory before anyone can organize resistance. And how would a widow know the strategies of raiders?" Bjorn asked suspiciously. Liv met his stare without flinching. "Because I've seen his work before. Because I know how men like Ragnar think." Her voice carried a weight of bitter experience. "He won't offer terms. He won't accept surrender. He comes not just to raid, but to rule, and he believes that fear is the foundation of all lasting power." The messenger nodded reluctantly. "She speaks truth. The villages that tried to surrender fared no better than those that fought. Then what do you suggest?" Magnus asked, and Rurik noticed how naturally the Jarl deferred to this woman he barely knew. Liv was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant as if she were seeing battles fought long ago. When she spoke, her words carried the ring of absolute certainty. "You cannot win through strength. Ragnar has too many warriors. You cannot win through walls. You have no time to build them. But you might win through guile if you're willing to take a terrible risk." "What kind of risk?" Rurik asked, though something in his chest was already tightening with dread. Liv turned to him, and in her eyes he saw depths he had never imagined. Oceans of loss and determination, and a kind of strength forged in fires he could barely comprehend, the kind that requires you to trust someone whose true name you do not know," she said quietly. The kind that demands you believe that sometimes the most dangerous gamble is also the only path to survival. The square fell silent save for the cry of gulls and the distant sound of waves against the harbour stones. Rurik felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, as if the world he had known for 3 years was revealing itself to be built on foundations far less solid than he had believed. The woman he had fed each evening, the quiet widow who had accepted his kindness with such graceful humility, was looking at him now with the eyes of someone who had commanded armies and shaped the fates of kingdoms. And in that moment, Rurik understood that their simple ritual of shared meals and unspoken companionship had been the calm before a storm that had been building for far longer than 3 days. "Who are you?" he asked, though part of him feared the answer. Liv's smile was sad and beautiful and terrible. "Someone who has been running from responsibility for too long," she said, "and perhaps the only chance this village has to see another sunrise." The war council convened in Jarl Magnus's longhouse as the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the smoke holes. Around the great table sat the village's most experienced men, Gunnar the elder, Bjorn the merchant, Eric the hunter, and Olaf the fisherman. Rurik took his place among them, his massive frame making the carved chair creak ominously. At the table's head sat Magnus himself, his weathered face grave with the weight of impossible decisions, but it was the woman who stood beside the hearth who commanded the room's attention. Liv had changed from her usual worn cloak into a simple but well-fitted dress of deep blue wool that somehow transformed her entire bearing. Her grey hair, usually bound in a modest braid, now fell in silver waves around shoulders held with unconscious authority. The transformation was so complete that several of the men kept glancing at her as if trying to reconcile this figure with the humble widow they thought they knew. "Tell us about this plan of yours," Magnus said without preamble. Liv moved to the table's edge, her fingers tracing patterns on the polished wood as she spoke. "Ragnar Bloodaxe's strength lies in fear and overwhelming force. He expects villagers to either flee in panic or make doomed stands that he can crush with minimal losses. But his greatest weakness is his pride." "Pride?" Gunnar scoffed. "How does a man's pride become a weakness when he commands 20 ships?" "Because pride makes men predictable," Liv replied calmly. "Ragnar will come here expecting easy victory. He'll beach his ships in the harbour, confident that your small force poses no real threat. He'll demand your surrender, and when you refuse, as he knows you will, he'll order a direct assault to make an example of your defiance." Rurik leaned forward, studying her face. "You speak as if you've seen him fight before." Something flickered in Liv's eyes, a shadow of old pain quickly suppressed. "I've seen men like him. Warriors who mistake brutality for strength, who believe that fear equals respect. And how do we use this against him?" Magnus asked. Liv walked to the wall where a crude map of the village and surrounding coastline had been scratched into a wooden panel. Her finger traced the harbour's curve, the positioning of houses, the paths leading inland. "We give him exactly what he expects, at first. A token resistance that crumbles quickly, villagers fleeing in apparent panic toward the longhouse. He'll think the battle won before it truly begins." "You're talking about a feigned retreat," Eric said, understanding dawning in his voice. "But to what end? The longhouse cannot hold against 20 ships' worth of warriors." "No, it cannot," Liv agreed. "But while Ragnar's men are celebrating their easy victory and dividing the spoils, a small force could retake their ships." The room erupted in voices, some incredulous, others intrigued. Bjorn slammed his fist on the table for silence. "Madness!" he declared. "Those ships will be guarded." "Lightly," Liv countered. "Ragnar's arrogance is legendary. Once he believes a village conquered, he'll want his full force ashore to witness the submission of the survivors. A few guards left with the ships, nothing more." Rurik felt a chill of recognition. The plan was audacious, brilliant, and utterly ruthless in its understanding of warrior psychology. "You're not just talking about taking ships," he said slowly. "You're talking about burning them," Liv nodded. strand Ragnar's force on land, cut off their retreat, and suddenly 20 ships worth of raiders becomes manageable. Desperate men fight differently when they know they cannot flee. Even if this worked, Magnus said, we'd still face hundreds of warriors. Angry, desperate warriors, with nothing left to lose. True, but they would be trapped, outnumbered by a population that knows every path and hiding place for miles around. Instead of a quick raid, Ragnar would face a grinding siege, with winter approaching and no ships to carry supplies. Gunnar stroked his grey beard thoughtfully. It could work, he admitted grudgingly, but the timing would have to be perfect. And someone would have to lead the attack on the ships, someone who understands naval warfare and can move unseen. I'll do it, Rurik said immediately. No, Liv's response was sharp, final. You're needed here to lead the fighting retreat and make it convincing. This requires someone the raiders won't expect, someone they'll dismiss as harmless. The room fell silent as understanding dawned. Magnus looked at her with new respect and growing concern. You mean to lead it yourself? I know ships. I know how to move quietly, how to use fire as a weapon. Most importantly, I know how men like Ragnar think because... She stopped herself, the words hanging unfinished in the air. Because what? Rurik asked gently. Liv's hands tightened on the table's edge. For a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked, revealing depths of loss and determination that made the battle-scarred warriors around the table step back mentally. Because I've fought them before, she said finally. Because I've seen what happens to villages that fall to raiders like these. Because I've made mistakes before that cost innocent lives, and I will not make them again. The weight of unspoken history filled the longhouse like smoke. Rurik found himself studying this woman, who had shared his simple meals for 3 years, trying to reconcile the humble widow with the strategic mind now unfolding before them. Everything about her, the way she moved, spoke, commanded attention, suggested training and experience far beyond what any village widow should possess. There's something else, Eric said quietly. Even if we burn the ships, even if we trap Ragnar's force, we'll still need to defeat them in the end. That means killing hundreds of seasoned warriors. Are we prepared for that? The question hung heavy in the air. These were fishermen and farmers, not professional soldiers. The thought of the bloodshed to come sobered even the most enthusiastic supporters of Liv's plan. War is never clean, Liv said, her voice carrying the weight of experience. But sometimes the choice is between difficult action and certain destruction. Ragnar Bloodaxe leaves no survivors when he claims territory. Your wives, your children, your elderly, all would die or be enslaved. Is avoiding bloodshed worth that price? Rurik felt the familiar weight settling on his shoulders, the burden of leadership he had tried to leave behind when he came to Bjornstad. Round the table, he saw the same recognition in the other men's faces. They were past the point of peaceful solutions. We'll need weapons, he said pragmatically. Real weapons, not just farm tools and fishing knives. I can forge blade points, spearheads, arrowheads, Rurik offered. But it will take time we may not have. And we'll need to coordinate the retreat perfectly, Magnus added. Make it look convincing, without actually losing half our defenders in the process. Liv nodded approvingly. These are the right questions. But first, you must decide, are you truly willing to trust a plan from a woman whose past she will not fully reveal? The challenge hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Rurik looked around the table at faces weathered by years of honest work, men who had never asked for war, but now faced it nonetheless. In their eyes, he saw the same terrible understanding that was growing in his own heart. They were running out of choices. The decision came with the weight of desperation. Magnus looked around the table one final time, meeting each man's eyes, then nodded grimly. We follow her plan. May the gods forgive us for the blood that will be spilled. The longhouse emptied quickly as the men dispersed to begin preparations. But Rurik lingered. He watched Liv gather herself, the momentary vulnerability he had glimpsed disappearing behind her mask of calm determination. When they were alone, save for the crackling fire, he approached her slowly, as one might approach a wild creature that could either flee or strike. The silver arm ring, he said quietly. Liv's hand moved instinctively to her left wrist, where beneath her sleeve lay a band of precious metal she thought no one had noticed. Her eyes met his with a mixture of surprise and resignation. "You've seen it. 3 years of placing bowls in your hands," Rurik said. "I notice things. That's not the jewelry of a poor widow. The craftsmanship is too fine, the silver too pure. And there are marks on it, runes that speak of royal houses." Liv slowly pushed back her sleeve, revealing the arm ring in its full splendor. Even in the dim firelight, it gleamed with an inner radiance that spoke of master craftsmen and ancient traditions. The runes carved into its surface were not the crude scratches of local smiths, but the elegant work of court artisans. "It was a wedding gift," she said softly. "From a man who believed in justice and honor, who thought a crown was meant to serve rather than to rule." Was? He died defending those beliefs. Her voice carried the weight of old grief, carefully contained but never fully healed. Murdered by his own blood, by those who thought mercy was weakness and compassion was folly. Rurik felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, but the picture they formed was almost too large to comprehend. "You're not just nobility. I was Queen Thyra of Vestfjord," she said, the words falling between them like stones into still water. "Daughter of King Harald the Just, wife of King Gunnar the Wise, mother to Prince Bjorn, who died with his father on the night my cousin decided that a woman had no right to rule." The revelation hit Rurik like a physical blow. Queen Thyra. He had heard the name in stories told by traveling merchants, tales of a kingdom far to the south, where a woman had ruled with wisdom and strength until civil war had torn the realm apart. The stories had been vague, filtered through multiple retellings, but they spoke of betrayal, bloodshed, and a queen who had vanished in the chaos. "You've been hiding here for 3 years, he said, understanding flooding through him. "Running from responsibility," Thyra finished bitterly. "From duty, from the crown that cost me everything I loved. I told myself I had earned the right to peace, that I had given enough to kingship and war." She moved to the window, gazing out at the village where people scurried about in preparation for the coming storm. "But peace built on others' suffering is no peace at all. I sat on that bench every evening, accepting your kindness, watching this simple, honest community, and I thought I could just be live forever. I thought I could forget. Why tell me now?" Thyra turned back to him, and in her eyes he saw the transformation complete. The humble widow was gone entirely, replaced by a woman who had commanded armies and shaped the destinies of thousands. "Because you deserve to know who you've been feeding for 3 years. Because the plan I've proposed, it's not the strategy of a village widow with lucky guesses. It's the knowledge of someone who has fought raiders before, who has seen kingdoms fall to men like Ragnar Bloodaxe." She began to pace, her movements now carrying the restless energy of a caged wolf. "More than that, you deserve to know that I'm asking you to trust someone who failed before. My kingdom fell because I was too merciful, too willing to believe in the goodness of those closest to me. My husband and son died because I didn't act quickly enough when the signs of treachery appeared. That wasn't your fault, wasn't it?" Thyra's voice cracked with pain. "A queen's first duty is to protect her people. I failed them, and now I'm asking you to let me try again with yours." Rurik was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the magnitude of what she had revealed. The woman he had thought he was slowly coming to love was a figure from legend, someone whose choices had shaped the fate of kingdoms. Yet as he looked at her now, he saw not just the queen, but also the woman who had sat on that bench each evening, accepting his simple offering with such profound gratitude. "The bowl," he said suddenly. "What?" "That first night when I brought you food, you looked at it like it was the most precious thing you'd ever seen. I thought you were just hungry, but it wasn't that, was it?" Thyra's composure finally cracked, tears gathering in her eyes. "It was kindness without expectation. Food offered not because of who I was or what I could provide in return, but simply because I was hungry and you had enough to share. Do you have any idea how rare that is in the life of a queen? She wiped her eyes impatiently, angry at herself for the display of weakness. For 3 years, I've lived among people who see only Liv the widow, who judge me by my actions, not my bloodline, who offer friendship or ignore me based on who I am in their daily lives, not what titles I once carried. It was the first taste of freedom I'd ever known, and now you're giving it up, because freedom means nothing if it's purchased with others' lives. Because I've seen what Ragnar does to villages that resist him, and I cannot stand by and watch it happen again. Rurik moved closer, drawn by an impulse he didn't fully understand. For 3 years, I've been in love with a woman who didn't exist. Thyra met his eyes steadily. She did exist. She exists now. Liv is who I became when I learned what it meant to receive kindness instead of only giving commands. The crown is part of my past, but it's not all of who I am. Who are you then? Someone who wants very much to survive the next few days so she can continue accepting wooden bowls from a blacksmith who sees her heart instead of her history. Her smile was tremulous but genuine. Someone who hopes that learning her true name won't change the way he looks at her when evening comes. Outside, the sounds of preparation continued, weapons being sharpened, supplies being gathered, families making what might be their final preparations together. Soon they would face the storm that was coming. But for this moment, in the firelight of the longhouse, 2 people who had found unexpected love in the midst of deception allowed themselves to hope for a future beyond the coming battle. Dawn brought no relief from the weight of approaching doom. The village woke to the sound of Rurik's hammer ringing against steel, a rhythm that had begun before first light and showed no signs of stopping. Sparks flew from his forge like angry stars as he worked with desperate efficiency to arm his neighbors for the battle ahead. Young Eric stood nearby, watching the master smith transform raw iron into gleaming spearheads with movements that seemed almost magical in their precision. Each strike of the hammer was perfectly placed, each twist of the metal calculated to create maximum strength with minimal material. It was the work of someone who understood that lives would depend on every blade he forged. How many more? Eric asked, hefting a newly completed spear to test its balance. As many as iron and time allow, Rurik replied, without pausing in his work. Sweat gleamed on his massive frame, despite the cold morning air. But weapons alone won't save us. Have you practiced with the others as I showed you? Eric nodded, though his confidence was shaky. 2 days of intensive training could not transform fishermen into warriors, and they all knew it. The movements Rurik had taught them were simple but effective. Basic thrusts, parries, and formations designed to keep untrained fighters alive long enough to be useful. Still, when Eric imagined facing seasoned raiders in actual combat, his hands trembled despite his best efforts to appear brave. Across the village square, a different kind of preparation was taking place. Thyra moved among the women with quiet authority, organizing supplies and contingencies with the efficiency of someone long accustomed to logistics on a grand scale. She had shed the last pretense of being merely Liv the widow, though she still wore simple clothes and kept her silver, armoring hidden beneath her sleeve. The children and elderly will shelter in the grain storage chambers beneath Bjorn's warehouse, she explained to Astrid and the other women. If our plan fails and the raiders reach the longhouse, you'll have perhaps an hour before they think to search there. Use that time to reach the forest paths I've shown you. Astrid clutched her infant son closer to her chest. And if they find us even there? Thyra's expression softened with genuine compassion, but her voice remained steady. Then you fight for your children with whatever strength you have left. A mother defending her young is more dangerous than any warrior. Remember that. The truth was harsher than Thyra spoke aloud. If their gambit failed, if Ragnar's forces overwhelmed the village defenses, then the hiding places would only delay the inevitable. Raiders like these left no survivors when they claimed territory, and the forest offered scant refuge with winter approaching. But hope, even fragile hope, was better than despair. Word had come at midday that the enemy ships had been sighted. A fishing boat, returning early from the morning catch, reported dark sails on the horizon, moving steadily westward. Bjorn the merchant had counted them through his spyglass and confirmed their worst fears. 18 longships in tight formation, their dragon prows cutting through the waves with predatory grace. 18, not 20, Gunnar had muttered when the news reached the War Council. Small comfort, but every ship we don't face is a blessing. Thyra had studied the approaching fleet from the harbour's edge, her experienced eye cataloguing details that others might miss. The lead ship bore decorations that marked it as a commander's vessel. Carved dragon heads painted in blood red, shields hung along the gunwales in deliberate display of strength. But more telling were the smaller details, the way the other ships maintained precise formation despite varying wind conditions, the discipline evident in their coordinated movement, the absence of the chaotic racing that marked inexperienced raiders eager for plunder. These are not desperate men seeking easy wealth, she told Magnus quietly. This is a planned conquest, led by someone who understands naval warfare and long-term strategy. How long before they reach us? 2 hours, perhaps 3 if the wind stays light. Long enough to complete our preparations, but not long enough for second thoughts. The Jarl nodded grimly and moved away to finalize the defensive positions, leaving Thyra alone with her thoughts and the weight of command she had hoped never to bear again. The irony was not lost on her. For 3 years she had hidden from the responsibility of leadership, only to find herself once again planning battle strategies and making decisions that would determine whether innocent people lived or died. A familiar presence behind her made her turn. Rurik approached slowly, his smith's apron stained with soot and metal filings, his massive hands still carrying the warmth of the forge. In those pale blue eyes, she saw a reflection of her own fears and determination. "The weapons are ready," he said simply. "Not enough, but ready. The men know their positions, know the signals. Everything that can be prepared has been prepared. And you?" Thyra asked. "Are you ready to trust a deposed queen with the lives of everyone you care about?" Rurik considered the question seriously, as he considered most things. "I'm ready to trust the woman who has spent 3 years proving her character by how she treats the least powerful people around her. The woman who mends children's clothes and comforts sick mothers, and has never once asked for anything in return for the wisdom she shares." He paused, looking out at the approaching ships that were now visible as dark specks on the horizon. "The crown you once wore, that's just history. The kindness you've shown, the care you've taken with our people, even when you thought no one was watching, that's who you are." Thyra felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. For so long, she had defined herself by her failures, by the kingdom she had lost and the loved ones she had been unable to protect. But perhaps redemption was not about erasing past mistakes. Perhaps it was about using hard-won wisdom to make better choices when the stakes were just as high. "There's something else you should know," she said quietly. "About the plan, about what I'm asking you to do. The retreat cannot be entirely feigned. Some men will fall in the initial assault, or the ruse won't be convincing. I'm asking you to sacrifice lives to save lives, and that's a burden no one should have to bear." "I know," Rurik replied. "I've carried that burden before. It's part of why I came here seeking peace, and now I'm asking you to pick it up again." "No," he said gently. "We're asking each other to share it. That makes all the difference." On the horizon, the dark shapes of enemy sails grew larger with each passing moment. The enemy ships materialized from the grey afternoon like manifestations of nightmare made real. 18 dragon-proud longships cut through the harbour waters with predatory grace, their oars rising and falling in perfect synchronization. The sound of their approach carried clearly across the water, the rhythmic splash of oars, the creak of wood under strain, and underneath it all, the low chanting of warriors preparing their spirits for battle. From her position behind the grain warehouse, Thyra watched through a gap in the wooden slats as the lead vessel approached the beach. The ship was magnificent in its terrible beauty, 60 feet of seasoned oak reinforced with iron bands, its sail bearing the blood-red raven of Ragnar Bloodaxe. Warriors lined the gunwales, the shields creating a wall of painted wood and polished metal that spoke of professional military discipline. The first ship ground against the sandy beach with a sound like grinding bones. Warriors leaped over the sides before the vessel had fully stopped, their boots splashing in the shallow water as they formed immediate defensive lines. These were not the undisciplined raiders of legend, but seasoned professionals who moved with the fluid coordination of men who had fought together for years. A figure emerged from the lead ship's center, tall, broad-shouldered, with a magnificent beard braided with silver rings. Even at this distance, Ragnar Bloodaxe commanded attention through sheer presence. His armor was finer than anything worn by his men, his weapons obviously the work of master smiths, but it was his bearing that marked him as a leader. He moved with the confident swagger of someone who had never known defeat, never doubted his own superiority. Behind the first ship, the others beached in orderly succession. The process was efficient, practiced. Clearly, these warriors had performed this same landing dozens of times in dozens of harbors. Within minutes, nearly 400 armed men stood on Bjornstad's beach, organized into tight formations that could advance, retreat, or wheel into defensive positions at a word from their commander. "Impressive," Thyra whispered to herself, though her admiration was tempered by grim calculation. Everything about this force spoke of long planning and careful preparation. This was not a raid, but a conquest, and Ragnar clearly intended it to be the first of many. The raider chief raised his voice, and even across the distance his words carried clearly. "People of Bjornstad, I am Ragnar Bloodaxe, rightful king of the western coast. Your Jarl will come forward now to discuss terms, or we will discuss them over your burning homes." From his position near the longhouse, Magnus emerged into view. The elderly Jarl walked slowly but with dignity, flanked by 6 of his best men, including Rurik. They carried weapons but held them low, a careful balance between submission and defiance that Thyra recognized as good theater. "I am Magnus, Jarl of this settlement," the old man called back. "What terms do you offer?" Ragnar's laughter boomed across the square. "Terms? Old man, you mistake me for someone who negotiates with sheep. I offer you life as my thralls, nothing more. Kneel now, swear fealty to your new king, and perhaps I'll let your women live to serve my warriors." The calculated insult had its intended effect. Murmurs of anger rippled through Magnus's small band, hands tightening on weapon hilts. But the Jarl himself remained steady, playing his part in the deadly performance they had rehearsed. "And if we refuse, then you die badly instead of well. But first, I'll let you watch what happens to your families." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Thyra felt her own hands clench as old memories surfaced, her husband's voice speaking similar defiance to her cousin's forces. The last words of a king who had believed honor mattered more than survival. She forced the memories down. This time would be different. This time, she had learned that sometimes survival required sacrificing honor in small doses to preserve it in larger ones. Magnus straightened his shoulders and raised his sword. "Then we choose to die as free men." The response was immediate and devastating. Ragnar gestured casually, and 100 arrows whistled through the air. Magnus's small band scattered, some falling immediately, others diving for cover behind overturned carts and fishing boats. The Jarl himself took an arrow through the shoulder but kept moving, playing his part perfectly even as blood darkened his tunic. Forward! Ragnar roared, and his warriors surged across the beach like a breaking wave. What followed was controlled chaos, the appearance of desperate resistance gradually crumbling under overwhelming force. Rurik and the other defenders fought with careful choreography, giving ground steadily while making their retreat look like the natural result of superior numbers rather than planned strategy. Men fell on both sides, real blood staining the sand, real lives ending to maintain the illusion. From her hiding place, Thyra watched young Eric stumble and fall, an enemy spear catching him in the thigh. For a moment her heart stopped, but then she saw him roll behind cover and realized the wound was real but not fatal. The boy was learning the hardest lesson of warfare, that even in a planned engagement, Death walked among the living with casual indifference. The defenders' retreat led exactly where they had planned, toward the longhouse and the apparent safety of its thick walls. Ragnar's forces pursued with professional enthusiasm, sensing victory within their grasp. More arrows flew, more men fell, and the illusion of impending defeat became almost too convincing for comfort. But as the last defenders disappeared into the longhouse and barred the great doors behind them, Thyra noticed what she had been waiting for, the relaxation in the raiders' posture that came with anticipated victory. They had won, or believed they had, and that belief would make them careless. Behind her, the special force she had assembled waited in the shadows. 20 volunteers led by Gunnar's son Tormund, each carrying oil-soaked rags and flint. These were the village's best swimmers and boat handlers, men who could move silently through water and knew every current in the harbor. Their mission was simple in concept, terrifying in execution: reach the beached longships while Ragnar's attention was focused on the siege, set them ablaze, and somehow escape before the enemy realized what was happening. "Remember," Thyra whispered to Tormund, "the ships must burn completely. Damaged vessels can be repaired, but ash cannot be rebuilt." The young man nodded grimly. Like all of them, he understood that they were committing themselves to a path with no retreat. If they failed, if they were discovered too early, then every soul in Bjornstad would pay the price for their audacity. From the longhouse came the sound of axes against wood as Ragnar's men began their assault on the barred doors. Soon, very soon, the real battle would begin. The flames that consumed Ragnar's ships painted the harbor in shades of orange and gold as Tormund's volunteers completed their desperate mission. 18 longships burned like funeral pyres, their dragon prows wreathed in fire that reached toward the darkening sky. The acrid smell of burning tar and wood filled the air, and the raiders' triumphant shouts turned to cries of dismay as they realized the magnitude of their loss. Thyra watched from the grain warehouse as Ragnar himself emerged from the longhouse, his face a mask of fury that promised terrible retribution. The raider chief strode to the water's edge, his warriors parting before him like frightened children. For a long moment he stood silent, watching his fleet transform into smoking wreckage, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried across the harbor with the force of distant thunder. "Clever mice," he bellowed. "You think burning ships will save you? You think trapping wolves makes them less dangerous?" His laughter was harsh, brittle with rage. "You've only ensured that every man, woman, and child in this miserable village will die slowly." But as Ragnar turned to address his assembled warriors, something unexpected happened. A horn sounded from the forest, not the rough sheep's horn that local hunters used, but the deep, resonant note of a war horn crafted for battlefield communication. Then another answered from the eastern hills, and another from the north. Thyra felt her blood turn to ice water. Those were not the horns of local allies. Magnus had already confirmed that no help was coming from neighboring settlements. These sounds carried a different quality, a martial precision that spoke of professional military organization. From the tree line emerged a sight that made both defenders and raiders freeze in shocked recognition. Warriors in gleaming mail stepped from the shadows, their shields bearing the golden wolf of Vestfjord, Thyra's own royal house. At their head rode a figure she had hoped never to see again, her cousin Eriksson, the man who had murdered her husband and son and stolen her throne. He had grown older in the 3 years since their last meeting, his beard now shot through with grey, but he still carried himself with the arrogant bearing of someone who believed might made right. His armor was magnificent, polished steel inlaid with gold, a helm crowned with a circlet that proclaimed his stolen kingship. Behind him came 200 warriors, their formation perfect, their weapons the finest money could craft. Ragnar Bloodaxe. Eriksson called, his voice carrying easily across the water. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." The raider chief turned, his hand instinctively moving to his sword hilt. "King Eriksson!" "I wasn't expecting you to arrive so soon." "Nor I you," Eriksson replied with cold amusement, "though your signal fires were visible from quite a distance. Tell me, did you find what we discussed? Thyra's mind reeled as the implications crashed over her. This was no random raid. It was a trap. Somehow, Eriksson had learned of her location and orchestrated this entire assault to flush her from hiding. Ragnar Bloodaxe, the terror of the northern coast, was nothing more than a hunting hound sent to drive quarry into waiting nets. She's here, Ragnar confirmed, his earlier fury transforming into predatory satisfaction. Though the clever girl has proven more resourceful than expected. My ships burn thanks to her strategy. Ships can be replaced, Eriksson said dismissively. My dear cousin, however, has proven remarkably difficult to kill. I trust you haven't damaged her too badly? I have plans that require her to be recognizable. From her hiding place, Thyra felt the walls of her carefully constructed new life crumbling around her. Every choice she had made, every day of peace she had stolen, had been built on an illusion. Eriksson had never stopped hunting her, never accepted that she might choose exile over vengeance. Somehow he had tracked her here, orchestrated this elaborate ruse to force her into the open. Worse still, she realized the true scope of his plan. This wasn't just about capturing her, it was about destroying any possibility of her ever reclaiming her throne. By arranging for her to be found, leading the defense of a remote village, he could paint her as a petty war criminal, a deposed queen reduced to hiding among peasants and orchestrating the deaths of simple fishermen. Her reputation, the one thing that might have allowed her to challenge his rule, would be ruined beyond repair. Bring her out, Eriksson commanded, his voice carrying the authority of absolute power. I know you can hear me, dear cousin. Come out and face what you've brought upon these innocent people. In the longhouse, the sounds of combat had ceased. Through the broken doors came Magnus and the surviving defenders, herded at spear point by Ragnar's warriors. The Jarl's shoulder was bandaged, but he walked upright, maintaining his dignity even in defeat. Rurik emerged last, his massive frame making the raiders around him look like children, but even he was dwarfed by the hopelessness of their situation. I grow impatient, Eriksson called. For every minute you delay, I'll have one of these villages flayed alive. Starting with the largest one, he looks like he might take some time to die. 2 of Ragnar's men moved toward Rurik, their intent clear. Thyra felt something inside her chest tear like fabric under too much strain. For 3 years she had told herself that avoiding her cousin's wrath would protect innocent people from getting caught in their family's blood feud. Now she saw the truth. There was no avoiding it, no hiding from it. Eriksson would use anyone, destroy anything, to satisfy his paranoid need to eliminate every threat to his stolen crown. She stood slowly, pushing aside the wooden slats that had concealed her. Every eye turned toward her as she stepped into the open, her simple dress and worn cloak marking her as just another village woman. But something in her bearing, some indefinable quality of command, made even the hardened raiders step back slightly. "Hello, Eriksson," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the distance. "Still killing your own family, I see." Her cousin's face split in a smile of genuine pleasure. "There she is. The rightful Queen of Vestfjord, reduced to playing peasant in a fishing village. Tell me, dear cousin, how does it feel to watch your subjects burn for your pride?" "They're not my subjects," Thyra replied calmly. "They're my friends. Something you wouldn't understand, friends." Eriksson laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "You think these people care about you? Wait until they learn that their suffering exists solely because they harbored a fugitive queen. Wait until they realize that every death today happened because Thyra the Exiled was too selfish to face justice for her crimes." The accusation hung in the air like poison. Around the square, Thyra could see the villagers' faces as they began to understand the full scope of what had been hidden from them. Some showed shock, others anger. A few, the terrible comprehension of people who realized they had been used as pawns in a game they never knew they were playing. But when Thyra looked at Rurik, she saw something different in his pale blue eyes. Not betrayal or anger, but a kind of fierce protectiveness that made her heart stop. He was looking at her the way a man looked at something precious that he intended to defend regardless of the cost. She led the defense that saved half our lives, Rurik said, his deep voice cutting through Ericsson's mockery. Whatever name she bears, whatever crown she once wore, she's proven herself to us by her actions. Touching, Ericsson replied, but ultimately irrelevant. Ragnar, bring her to me. It's time this farce ended. As the raiders moved to obey, Thyra made her choice. She had spent 3 years running from responsibility, telling herself that avoiding conflict would protect others. Now she understood that some fights could not be avoided. They could only be delayed until the consequences became unbearable. Wait, she called, her voice carrying the authority of someone born to command. If you want me, Ericsson, then face me yourself. Unless the crown has made you as much a coward as it has a kinslayer. The challenge echoed across the harbour, and for the first time since his arrival, Ericsson's confident smile faltered slightly. The challenge hung in the air between them, like a blade balanced on its edge. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the entire harbour fell silent, save for the crackling of burning ships and the distant cry of gulls. Ericsson's face cycled through emotions, surprise, calculation, and finally a cold amusement that made Thyra's skin crawl. A formal challenge? He said, his voice carrying across the water with theatrical projection. How wonderfully old-fashioned. But surely you remember what happened the last time someone challenged my authority. Your husband tried that approach, if I recall correctly. The barb hit home with surgical precision. Thyra felt the familiar weight of grief and guilt settle on her shoulders, but she forced herself to stand straighter. Gunnar had died defending principles that Ericsson could never understand. Honor, justice, the belief that strength should protect rather than dominate. His death had not been in vain, if it taught her the lessons she needed to survive this moment. I remember, she said quietly. I remember that you murdered him while he slept, because you knew he would defeat you in fair combat. Ericsson's warriors shifted uncomfortably at the accusation. Even among men accustomed to violence, there were rules, codes of honor that separated warriors from mere killers. A king who would not face his enemies in honest battle was a king who ruled through fear alone, and fear was a foundation that could crumble without warning. Careful. Cousin, Ericsson warned, his voice losing some of its theatrical confidence. You're in no position to make accusations, no? Thyra began walking toward the harbour, her simple dress and worn cloak making her look like any village woman approaching the water to wash clothes. But her posture, the way she moved with unconscious authority, gradually transformed her from peasant to queen with each step. Then let me make a proposal instead. She stopped at the water's edge, close enough that everyone could hear her clearly, far enough that she remained beyond easy reach. Around her, she could feel the village watching, people who had known her as Liv, the humble widow, now seeing the crown that had always rested invisible on her brow. Single combat, she called. You and I, here and now, witnessed by both our forces. The winner takes everything. My life, your throne, the loyalty of everyone watching. Ragnar Bloodaxe laughed, a sound like grinding stone. She's desperate, my lord. Trying to trick you into... Silence! Ericsson snapped, his eyes never leaving Thyra's face. She could see him calculating, weighing odds, considering angles. He was not a warrior by nature. His victories came through politics and treachery rather than personal prowess. But he was also not stupid enough to refuse a challenge so publicly without losing face before his own men. And why, he asked carefully, would I agree to such terms? I have 600 warriors to your, 30 surviving villages. Victory is already mine. Because you're not just fighting for victory, Thyra replied. You're fighting for legitimacy. For 3 years, you've ruled as a usurper, always looking over your shoulder, always wondering which noble will be the next to challenge your right to the crown. But if you defeat me in single combat, witnessed by warriors from across the northern lands, then no one can question your claim ever again. The word struck home. Thyra could see it in the way Ericsson's jaw tightened, the way his hand moved unconsciously to the crown that adorned his helm. He had taken the throne through blood and betrayal, but keeping it required something more. the appearance of legitimacy, the belief among his followers that he ruled by right rather than merely by might. "And if you win?" he asked, though they both knew the question was academic. Even if she somehow managed to defeat him, she would still face 600 of his warriors with nothing but fishing nets and farming tools for support. "If I win, your men leave this village in peace and never return. The people of Bjornstad are granted protection under the old laws, free from taxation or tribute to any crown." It was a clever gambit, and Eriksson recognized it immediately. By framing the stakes around the village's welfare rather than her own survival, Thyra was appealing to the sense of honor that still existed among his warriors. Men who might cheerfully slaughter civilians on direct orders would think twice about harming people their king had sworn to protect as part of a formal agreement. But there was another calculation at work, one that Thyra was betting Eriksson's pride would make for him. He genuinely believed he was the superior fighter, the stronger leader, the rightful king. In his mind, this challenge was not a risk but an opportunity, a chance to demonstrate his dominance so completely that no one would ever question him again. "Very well," Eriksson said, dismounting from his horse with fluid grace. "Single combat it is, but we do this properly. Ancient law, ancient weapons, ancient witnesses." He gestured to his men, who immediately began clearing a circle in the sand large enough for formal combat. Other warriors spread out to form a human arena, their shields creating boundaries that no outside interference could cross. The ritual was old, older than kingdoms, older perhaps than the gods themselves. When two leaders met in single combat, the outcome was considered the will of fate itself. From her position near the longhouse, Astrid clutched her infant son and whispered prayers to any deity who might be listening. Around her, the other village women watched with expressions of hope and terror as their mysterious protector, prepared to risk everything on the outcome of a single fight. Rurik felt his hands clench involuntarily as he watched. Thyra walked toward the combat circle. Every instinct screamed at him to intervene, to find some way to protect the woman he loved from a fate she had chosen but might not survive. Yet he also understood, with the clarity of someone who had faced similar choices, that this was her fight to make. Some battles could only be won by the person who had the most to lose. "Weapons," Eriksson announced, accepting a magnificent sword from one of his retainers. The blade gleamed like captured sunlight, its edge sharp enough to part silk, its balance perfect. This was not just a weapon, but a work of art, forged by masters who understood that a king's sword was as much symbol as tool. Thyra looked around the circle, her eyes searching for something suitable among the scattered debris of battle. Her gaze settled on a simple iron blade that had fallen from the hand of one of Ragnar's warriors, well made but unornamented, the kind of weapon carried by professional soldiers rather than kings. "That one will serve," she said, bending to retrieve it. The sword felt familiar in her grip, its weight and balance triggering muscle memories from years of training that seemed like another lifetime. She had been taught swordplay by the same masters who trained her husband, men who believed that a ruler should be capable of defending both kingdom and crown with personal skill. But as she hefted the blade, testing its edge against her thumb, Thyra realized something that sent ice through her veins. Her hands, soft from 3 years of peaceful village life, showed none of the calluses that marked a practiced warrior. Her muscles, though still strong from daily labor, lacked the specific conditioning that came from regular sword work. She was facing a man in his prime, with superior equipment and recent battle experience, while she carried the disadvantages of someone who had chosen peace over preparedness. The irony was bitter. In choosing to leave her old life behind, she had also abandoned the skills that might have allowed her to reclaim it. "Second thoughts, dear cousin?" Eriksson asked, noting her hesitation with predatory satisfaction. "It's not too late to kneel and beg for a quick death," Thyra looked around the circle one more time, her eyes finding Rurik's across the crowd. In his pale blue gaze, she saw everything she had come to value in her new life: steady affection, quiet strength, the kind of love that asked for nothing but offered everything. For 3 years, he had given her the gift of being seen for who she chose to be, rather than what she had been born to become. If she died today, at least she would die as someone worthy of that gift. "I'm ready," she said, raising her sword in formal salute. Eriksson smiled and matched her gesture, his blade catching the late afternoon light like captured fire. Around them, 600 warriors fell silent, understanding that they were about to witness something that would be remembered in songs and stories for generations to come. The circle was drawn. The weapons were chosen. The stakes were set. All that remained was to discover what the gods had decided about the fate of a village, a crown, and a woman who had learned too late that some responsibilities could never be abandoned, only postponed. The first clash of steel rang across the harbor like a bell tolling for the dead. Eriksson came forward with the fluid confidence of someone who had never doubted his own superiority, his magnificent blade weaving patterns of light as he tested Thyra's defenses with exploratory strikes. Each movement was precise, calculated, designed to gauge her skill while revealing none of his own capabilities. Thyra gave ground steadily, her simple iron sword barely managing to deflect his attacks. 3 years of peaceful village life had indeed taken their toll. Her reflexes were slower than they once had been, her endurance already showing signs of strain. But beneath the rust of disuse, older training reasserted itself. Her feet found the proper stance, her grip adjusted to the familiar balance of blade and pommel. Her eyes began reading the subtle tells that preceded each of Eriksson's movements. "You're slower than I remember," Eriksson said conversationally as he pressed his attack. "Age and soft living have made you weak, dear cousin." He punctuated his words with a thrust that would have taken her in the chest if she hadn't twisted aside at the last moment. The point of his blade whistled past her ribs, close enough that she felt the wind of its passage through her dress. Around the circle she heard gasps from the villagers who understood how close to death that strike had come. "Perhaps," she replied, falling back another step to buy herself time to think. "But you talk more than you used to. Is that confidence or nervousness?" Eriksson's response was a flurry of strikes that came so fast they seemed to blur together, high cut, low thrust, diagonal slice, each delivered with the kind of precision that spoke of years devoted to the art of killing. Thyra managed to deflect most of them, but one caught her on the forearm, opening a line of red that immediately began soaking through her sleeve. The sight of blood seemed to energize Eriksson's warriors, who began chanting his name in rhythmic unison. The sound was intimidating, meant to break the concentration of his opponent, but Thyra found herself oddly comforted by it. In the harsh cadence of their voices, she heard echoes of other battles, other challenges faced and overcome when the odds seemed impossible. She remembered the siege of Raven's Hollow, when her father's forces had been outnumbered 3-1, but had held the walls through determination and tactical brilliance. She remembered the Battle of Thornfield, where her husband had broken a rebel army twice the size of his own through careful use of terrain and weather. Most of all, she remembered the lesson both men had tried to teach her, that victory rarely went to the strongest fighter, but to the one who best understood what the fight was really about. This combat wasn't about sword skill or physical prowess. It was about legitimacy, about the question of what gave someone the right to rule. Eriksson fought to prove his superiority, to demonstrate that might made right and that the crown belonged to whoever could hold it through force. But Thyra fought for something different, for the principle that leadership meant service, that a crown was a burden to be carried rather than a prize to be seized. That understanding shifted something fundamental in her approach to the combat. Instead of trying to match Eriksson's aggressive style, she began fighting defensively, using his own momentum against him. When he pressed forward with overwhelming force, she gave ground and let him overextend. When he tried to end the fight with powerful strikes, she redirected them into empty air and made him work to regain his balance. "Stand and fight," Eriksson snarled, frustrated by her evasive tactics. "Stop running and face me like a warrior." "I am facing you," Thyra replied calmly, deflecting another thrust and stepping aside as he stumbled past. "The question is whether you're wise enough to see it." The exchange continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Sweat gleamed on both combatants despite the cool air, their breathing becoming labored as the intensity of the fight took its toll. Eriksson's strikes remained powerful, but were growing slightly less precise, while Thyra's defense was showing more gaps as fatigue wore down her concentration. Around the circle, the watching warriors had fallen silent, understanding that they were witnessing something more significant than a simple duel. This was a clash between two different philosophies of power, two competing visions of what it meant to rule. The outcome would determine not just who lived or died, but what kind of kingdom would emerge from the ashes of their family's blood feud. Rurik watched from his position among the prisoners, his massive hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. Every fiber of his being wanted to intervene, to break through the circle of spears and throw himself between Thyra and the blade that sought her life. But he understood that doing so would invalidate everything she was fighting for, would reduce her grand gesture to a meaningless sacrifice. Instead, he found himself praying to gods he had almost forgotten, offering bargains he had no right to make if they would only grant her the strength to survive this trial. The sun was beginning to set, painting the harbor in shades of gold and crimson that made the steel in their hands look like captured fire. The moment of decision came without warning, as such moments often do. Eriksson, growing impatient with Thyra's defensive tactics, committed himself to a devastating overhead strike designed to cleave her from crown to waist. It was a powerful blow, delivered with all the strength of his considerable skill, but it was also exactly the kind of overcommitment Thyra had been waiting for. She stepped forward instead of back, moving inside his reach, where his long blade could not function effectively. Her simple iron sword rose to meet his descending strike, deflecting it just enough to send the magnificent royal blade past her shoulder. For a heartbeat, they stood locked together, her left hand gripping his sword wrist, his free hand clutching at her shoulder. In that moment of intimate combat, their eyes met across mere inches of space. Eriksson's gaze held the shocked realization that his certainty of victory had been misplaced, while Thyra's showed not triumph, but a kind of sad acceptance of what had to be done. "You could have been a good king," she whispered, her voice too low for anyone else to hear, "if you had learned to serve instead of simply to rule." Her iron blade found the gap between his breastplate and helm, sliding through flesh and bone with the finality of justice long delayed. Eriksson's eyes widened, not with pain but with genuine surprise, as if he had never truly believed that anyone might be capable of defeating him. "Impossible," he breathed, blood frothing at his lips. "No," Thyra replied gently, supporting his weight as he sagged against her. "Just inevitable. Your father should have taught you that a crown is not a prize to be won, but a burden to be carried. Perhaps in your next life you'll understand the difference." Eriksson collapsed to his knees, then toppled sideways into the sand. The magnificent sword that had represented his stolen authority fell from nerveless fingers, its polished steel now stained with the blood of its wielder. Around the circle, absolute silence reigned as 600 warriors tried to process what they had just witnessed. Thyra stood over her cousin's body for a moment, her chest heaving with exhaustion and something that might have been grief. Despite everything he had done, despite the murders and betrayals, Eriksson had still been family. His death brought no joy, only the bitter satisfaction of a duty finally completed. She turned to face the assembled warriors, her bloodied sword still in her hand, her simple village dress torn and stained, but her bearing unmistakably royal. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the harbor, reaching every ear present. "I am Thyra, daughter of Harald the Just, rightful Queen of Vestfjord. Your king is dead by the ancient law of single combat, his claim to the throne dissolved by his defeat. You have a choice now. Serve me as your lawful sovereign, or depart these lands and seek your fortunes elsewhere. But know this, if you choose to serve, you serve the crown, not the person who wears it. You serve justice, not conquest. You serve the protection of the innocent, not the domination of the weak. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. These were men who had followed Eriksson in his quest for power, who had benefited from his conquests and shared in his plunder. But they were also professional warriors who understood the significance of what they had witnessed. The outcome of single combat was considered the judgment of the gods themselves, and to defy it would be to court disaster beyond imagining. Slowly, one of Eriksson's captains stepped forward, a grizzled veteran whose scarred face spoke of a lifetime spent in service to various kings. He looked at Thyra for a long moment, studying her bearing, her resolve, the way she held herself despite exhaustion and injury. "You fought with honor," he said finally. "You speak of justice and protection rather than conquest and glory. These are words we have not heard from a ruler in many years." He knelt in the sand, placing his sword at her feet in the ancient gesture of fealty. "I am Gunther Ironarm, captain of the Royal Guard. I offer my service to Queen Thyra of Vestfjord, rightful sovereign of these lands." The gesture broke the spell that had held the other warriors motionless. One by one, then in growing numbers, they began to kneel. Not all, perhaps a third, chose to walk away rather than serve a new master, and Thyra made no move to stop them. Those who remained, however, knelt with genuine respect rather than mere obligation. Ragnar Bloodaxe, who had watched the entire combat with professional interest, approached the edge of the circle. His weathered face bore an expression of grudging admiration as he looked at the woman who had just reclaimed a kingdom through personal combat. "Well fought, Your Majesty," he said with formal courtesy. "I serve whoever pays my warriors, and dead kings pay no wages. What are your orders?" Thyra looked around the harbor, at the burning ships, the scattered debris of battle, the villagers who watched her with expressions ranging from awe to uncertainty. These simple people had known her as Liv the Widow, had accepted her kindness and offered their own in return. Now they saw her revealed as a queen, and she could read the questions in their faces. The crown might be reclaimed, but the hardest battles were yet to come. 3 months after the battle, the village square looked much as it always had, save for the stone monument that now marked the place where 18 longships had burned. Children played around its base while their mothers gathered water from the well, their conversations carrying the comfortable rhythm of a community that had survived crisis and found itself stronger for the experience. Rurik emerged from his forge as the sun touched the western hills, carrying the familiar wooden bowl that had become the symbol of something far more precious than either of them had originally understood. The bowl bore new scars now, a crack along one side where it had fallen during the battle, carefully mended with iron wire that caught the light like silver thread. Sometimes the most beautiful things were those that had been broken and healed. Thyra sat on the same bench where she had waited each evening for 3 years, though now she wore the simple crown of her ancestors, a circlet of silver and amber that proclaimed her royal status without ostentation. Her dress was still humble village wool, her manner still gracious and approachable, but there was something different in her bearing now. The weight of hidden identity had been lifted, replaced by the comfortable authority of someone who ruled by right rather than by concealment. "Your Majesty," Rurik said formally as he approached, though his eyes twinkled with gentle humor. "Just Thyra," she replied, accepting the bowl with the same graceful nod she had always used. "Or Liv, if you prefer. I answer to both now, and if I prefer, simply beloved." Her smile transformed her entire face, erasing years of carefully controlled grief and replacing them with the kind of joy that comes from finally being known completely and loved without reservation. "I think I could learn to answer to that as well." They sat together in comfortable silence as the evening shadows lengthened. Around them, the village continued its ancient rhythms. Fishermen returning from the day's catch, women calling children home for supper, elderly men sharing ale and stories outside the tavern. It was a scene of such perfect normalcy that a stranger might never guess this small community had recently been the site of a battle that determined the fate of kingdoms. "Any word from the council?" Rurik asked, referring to the assembly of nobles and jarls who had been debating Thyra's restoration for months. "They've agreed to recognize my claim," she said with satisfaction, though some required more convincing than others. "It seems that defeating a usurper in single combat carries considerable weight in questions of legitimacy." And Ragnar's men, settling into their new roles admirably. It's remarkable how quickly former raiders adapt to being royal guards when they're paid regularly and treated with respect. She paused, her expression growing more serious. "Though I suspect some of them still struggle with the idea of protecting rather than conquering." It had been perhaps the most delicate aspect of her restoration, convincing several hundred professional warriors to embrace a completely different philosophy of service. Not all had stayed, but those who remained were gradually learning that strength could be used to build rather than destroy. The true victory came through protection rather than domination. "The village seems to have adapted well to having a queen in residence," Rurik observed. Thyra laughed, a sound like silver bells in a gentle breeze. "I think they prefer having Liv, who happens to be a queen, rather than a queen who happens to live here. Astrid still brings me her accounting problems. Old Helga still asks my advice about herb remedies, and young Eric still expects me to mend his hunting clothes when he tears them on brambles. And you still accept wooden bowls from a blacksmith who loves you, most especially that." The simplicity of their evening ritual had become even more precious now that it was a choice rather than a necessity. Thyra could dine in the finest halls of her restored kingdom, could command feasts that would feed entire villages. But she preferred this: shared food, quiet conversation, and the knowledge that she was loved for who she was, rather than what she represented. "There is one thing that's changed," she said thoughtfully. "What's that?" "I'm no longer running from who I am. For 3 years, I told myself that peace meant abandoning responsibility, that safety required hiding from duty. But true peace, the kind worth having, comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong, doing exactly what you're meant to do." Rurik considered this as he watched the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. "And where do you belong?" "Here," Thyra said without hesitation. "With you, with this community ruling a kingdom that exists to serve its people rather than the other way around. My father always said that a crown was heaviest when worn properly, but I understand now what he meant. The weight comes not from the gold, but from the knowledge that every decision affects lives beyond your own." She reached into her sleeve and withdrew the silver arm ring that had first revealed her true identity to Rurik. Its surface still bore the royal runes, still proclaimed her lineage and legitimacy, but now it seemed less like a burden and more like a reminder of lessons learned through loss and love. "Will you marry a queen?" she asked suddenly, the question carrying none of the formal gravity such proposals usually demanded. "Only if she's willing to marry a blacksmith," Rurik replied, his massive hand covering hers with gentle certainty. "I think that can be arranged." As full darkness settled over Bjornstad, two people who had found love in the midst of deception and war sat together in perfect contentment. The wooden bowl rested empty between them, its simple purpose fulfilled once again. Tomorrow would bring the complexities of ruling a kingdom, the challenges of rebuilding what had been broken, the endless work of turning ideals into reality. But tonight there was only this: the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled, love declared, and a future built on the strongest foundation possible. Two hearts that had learned to trust completely despite every reason for caution. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness truly did carry the greatest power to change a life forever.